The VapePassion Show, Episode 10. Hey everybody, what's up? I'm your host Alex, your resident vaping enthusiast, blogger, and reviewer at VapePassion.com. In this show, we cover the latest news and research in vaping and provide tips and advice for vapers of all levels. In this episode, we're talking about the knowledge gap among physicians on e-cigarettes, how a study found that cigarettes cost less than vaping, the long-term benefits of vaping for asthma sufferers, the failed e-cigarette tax in Maryland, why investors should not invest in big tobacco e-cig stocks, how Philip Morris is trying to get people to vape their poisonous tobacco, misleading pro-vaping arguments we should stop using, why you shouldn't buy from e-liquid manufacturers who infringe on trademarks, why vaping is not only about quitting smoking but also enjoyment, why e-juice flavors are not designed to market to kids, Mooch's updated recommended batteries list, and creating extracts for e-juice. Alright, so tonight I'm vaping on Hypno from Vapers Anonymous line from VapeCraft. It's a cinnamon, chocolate, and caramel e-juice. It's pretty good. The cinnamon is stronger than the other flavors, but none of it is overpowering. And I'm drinking Joe IPA from 10 Barrel Brewing Company. The IPA goes really well with the cinnamon flavor of Hypno. Okay, so I know that my show has been a little disorganized, but I'm going to try and fix that by separating stories into segments. The segments that I have in my mind right now are advocacy first, when there's advocacy to talk about, research studies, what's happening around the country, and I would talk about stuff worldwide, but I don't really know a lot about the political systems in other countries, so I might try to include worldwide stuff here and there, but for the most part it's probably going to stick mostly to the United States. And then the final segment will be tips, tricks, and other fun stuff. So that's just going to be about interesting editorials or any kind of fun tips or tricks that I learn along the way. So the names and order of each segment might change over time, but that's what I'm thinking right now. So I hope it helps to keep a better flow to the show, and if any of you watching or listening have opinions on this, please let me know, because I really want to try and make this show better. Okay, so with that being said, I don't have any advocacy stuff to talk about this week, so I'm just going to jump right into research studies. So an anonymous online questionnaire was sent to all residents, fellows, and faculty in the departments of internal medicine and surgery at St. Louis University. They received 114 responses, and out of those responses, only 9% of them reported being very familiar with e-cigarettes, while 26% reported no familiarity. Of those 114 people, only 57% knew what vaping meant. 54% of them want stricter regulations, 53% want warning labels similar to tobacco products, and 36% want to restrict advertising. And even though so many of them really don't have much familiarity with e-cigarettes, 50% of them see a role for e-cigarettes as part of harm reduction strategy. So it was only 114 people, but to see so many of them not know hardly anything about e-cigarettes is staggering. The researchers concluded that there's an apparent knowledge gap among physicians and an urgent need for evidence-based guidelines to aid with advising smokers inquiring about e-cigarettes. Okay, moving on. So a study found that combustible tobacco cigarettes cost less than e-cigarettes. This study was led by researchers from the American Cancer Society and the University of Michigan School of Public Health. They compared the cost of combustible cigarettes to two major kinds of e-cigarettes: disposable e-cigarettes, which are non-refillable, and rechargeable e-cigarettes, which can be refilled with e-juice. So they compared the cost of tobacco cigarettes to electronic cigarettes in 45 different countries, and out of those 45 countries, they found that in 44 of them, tobacco cigarettes are cheaper. They said that on average, the price of a pack of tobacco cigarettes was just over half the price of a disposable e-cigarette, tobacco cigarettes costing $5 and disposable e-cigarettes costing $8.50. They do mention that refillable e-cigarettes may be cheaper because the liquid nicotine used to refill them can cost a couple of dollars less than a pack of regular cigarettes, but the minimum price to purchase a rechargeable e-cigarette is more than $20. So here's where I would think they went wrong with this study. E-cigarettes might be more expensive if you buy disposable e-cigarettes, but most people move on to better products pretty quickly. And sure, you might spend more in the beginning on hardware and things like that, but in the long term, that's where you save the money, because once you have the hardware, you're set. And I think another thing they're really missing here is that even if vaping was more expensive, what's important here is that people aren't smoking. Okay, and the last article in this research segment is about how a scientific article recently published by the University of Catania, Italy, found that former smokers with asthma who started using electronic cigarettes saw beneficial effects on their asthma symptoms. And because some of their participants have been using e-cigarettes for more than 2 years, they feel that there are long-term benefits as well. They gathered data for 16 regular vapers and 2 people who have relapsed back to smoking. They found that there were significant and stable improvements in respiratory symptoms, lung function, and they also had decreased tobacco consumption. So they found that with vapors with mild to moderate asthma had significantly improved test scores compared to their baselines, and even in the case of dual users, people who are smoking and vaping are seeing the benefits too. They point out that because of the small sample size, that it may not be representative of all asthmatic smokers who switch to e-cigarettes, but they do feel pretty confident in their data and recommend using electronic cigarettes for asthmatic smokers. Alright, so let's talk about what's happening around the country. So in May 2015, Maryland's Montgomery Council passed a 30% tax on the wholesale price of electronic cigarettes, but it looks like they massively misinterpreted the data and how much they were expecting to collect from these taxes. They were expecting to bring in around 1.5 million to 2.5 million per year, which they had hoped to provide revenue for schools. Well, as of February 29th, they found that the taxes had only raised $175,000, which is about 80% short of what they were expecting. So not only is this tax not helping the county, but it's probably hurting the local businesses in the area because people are buying out of state or buying online, and it's also making it harder for people who want to quit smoking to find the products that they need. I'd say based on the results of this tax hike, they should probably consider removing it. Alright, this next story is from Fool.com. So this is for any of you out there who invest in stocks. Basically, their advice is that even though the electronic cigarette market is booming, in regards to big tobacco electronic cigarette products, there's really not a lot of money in it right now. So they point out the market leaders, who are Reynolds American and their Views product, which is the most popular e-cigarette brand in America, and then the other top brands, which are Altria's Mark 10 and Imperial Tobacco Group's Blue. So Reynolds controlled 24% of the market in 2015, and Altria and Imperial Tobacco Group controlled only single-digit shares. So Reynolds generated $368 million in sales in 2015, which is only 3% of its top line, but they group Views in with their nicotine gum under the all other brands, so they don't even report separately how much money e-cigarettes are making from their other products. And Altria, they do the same thing. They group their electronic cigarettes revenue in with their smokeless tobacco and wine, which only accounted for 7% of their overall sales in 2015. There are estimates that the U.S. e-cigarette market could grow at a compound annual growth rate of 33% between 2015 and 2019, but a market research firm named IRI reported that sales of electronic cigarettes have actually fallen year over year for 3 consecutive months now, declining 0.5% in December, 1.7% in January, and 2.2% in February. And that's not to mention things like public bans on vaping, the new FDA regulations that are about to come through, and all of the bad media reports regarding things like teen use and battery explosions, all of which could be hurting electronic cigarette sales. And with all of the state governments trying to implement excise tax on electronic cigarettes, that could also increase the cost benefit of electronic cigarettes, further affecting sales. So while I doubt that many of you watching or listening are investing in big tobacco, if you are, it doesn't look to be very profitable. So changing the subject away from investing and instead to small business, I wonder how a lot of these things are affecting the sales for local vape shops. They bring up a lot of good points here about the public bans on vaping and FDA regulations and all of these new taxes, and it makes me wonder how risky it is to start up a local vape shop. I've actually looked into it a little bit myself a couple of months ago. I thought it might be interesting to go into business for myself, but with all of these things coming down the line, it really put me off of the idea. I'd love to know what vape shop owners think about that. I'm sure they're scared too. Alright, in other news, Philip Morris International, the makers of Marlboro cigarettes, have released a new device that heats tobacco instead of burning it. They're calling it the IQOS, and they claim that it releases fewer harmful chemicals than cigarettes. So the way it works is you place a tube of tobacco that resembles a cigarette into the vaporizer chamber, and then there's a metal blade within the device that heats up the tobacco to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The user will get about a dozen puffs out of the device, and they say it tastes similar to traditional cigarettes. The sticks are reported to smell just like tobacco, but Philip Morris states that it produces less odor. Analysts are saying that the IQOS could be better than an electronic cigarette because it gives users a better nicotine buzz. And Wells Fargo analysts are predicting that the IQOS could replace around 30% of cigarette sales by 2025. Okay, so what I see wrong here is that they're still placing the tobacco that they create into this device. And who knows what's in that tobacco? It's probably everything that's in their cigarettes. So yeah, you might be vaping it, and it's probably giving users a more accurate traditional cigarette taste. Those people are probably putting all those same crappy chemicals into their lungs that you would find in a regular cigarette. Personally, I wouldn't trust it. Okay, so let's get into the tips and tricks and other fun stuff segment of this episode. And I'm looking at some of the articles that I'm going to be talking about here, and I realize that I might need to change the name of this segment because not all of it's fun and not all of it's tips and tricks. I do believe it's still interesting, but it doesn't really fit within that title. But anyway, this first one we're going to talk about is an article from ecigarettereview.com. They published a post titled 6 Misleading Pro-Vaping Arguments We Should Stop Using. Okay, so number 1 on the list, e-liquid only has 4 ingredients. So while the core point is true, what a lot of people are saying is that cigarettes contain thousands of chemicals, whereas e-cigarettes contain just 4. PG, VG, nicotine, and flavorings. So while the core point is true, saying 4 ingredients is incorrect. The main problem being flavorings, because that is not just one ingredient. Flavorings can contain ethyl maltol, vanillin, ethyl vanillin, benzaldehyde, ethyl butyrate, menthol, ethyl acetate, and there are also trace levels of nitrosamines. And another thing to consider is that when we say something like 7,000 chemicals in cigarettes, most of that is caused by the smoke from cigarettes, not from uncombusted cigarettes. And that same logic should be applied to electronic cigarettes because once you turn the e-juice into vapor, there are very low levels of chemicals such as formaldehyde, acrolein, and various metals. So what we should say instead is, e-cigarette vapor contains vastly fewer chemicals than cigarette smoke, and any toxic chemicals that are present are in quantities so low that they're not expected to cause any harm. Okay, number 2. All of the ingredients in e-cigarettes are generally recognized as safe. So it's technically true, but it's misleading because that doesn't apply to inhaling the chemicals, only ingesting them. From what we've seen so far since the inception of vaping is that inhaling flavorings probably isn't going to kill you, but there isn't enough information about the risks to claim that as a fact. The authors of this post are saying that this argument should just be ditched entirely. Okay, number 3. PG is used in asthma inhalers. Now this one is funny because I think I've actually used this one myself because from what I've read online, that's what people are saying. I assumed it to be true. Well, it turns out that there's actually no evidence that show any asthma inhalers or nebulizers today are actually using PG. But it's also hard to prove that it isn't being used because manufacturers just aren't reporting it. But because some people find that PG is irritating to the throat, it's very unlikely that pharmaceutical companies would be putting PG in the medicine. And another point here is that even if there was PG in an asthma inhaler, there's a pretty big difference between inhaling a few puffs of your asthma inhaler compared to the way we use vaporizers. They're just not really comparable. So what we could say instead is that while propylene glycol has been well studied and is used in theatrical fog machines and other consumer products, it might not be entirely safe to inhale directly, but it still poses far less risks than smoking. Okay, number 4. Nobody has died from vaping. So yes, this is absolutely true, but the thing is, vaping has only been around for about 10 years. We don't have enough research to make that claim. Back when people started smoking, you could make the same claim after only 10 years. So instead of using the argument that nobody has died from vaping, instead you could say, no related health problems have been documented in vapors, and the evidence to date shows that vaping is much safer than smoking. Number 6. Cigarettes have 750 times more diacetyl than e-liquids. So it is true that cigarettes contain a lot more diacetyl than e-juice, but the figure of 750 times more is inaccurate because the origin of this figure comes from Dr. Michael Siegel's blog post in response to the most recent diacetyl study, and he made the comparison based on a consumption of only 1 milliliter of e-liquid per day versus a pack of cigarettes. And the reason this is inaccurate is because anyone who vapes regularly is not vaping only 1 milliliter of e-juice per day. Most of us are vaping a lot more than that. So a more accurate claim would be that there is 100 to 200 times less diacetyl in e-juice than there is in cigarettes. Okay, number 6. Smokers don't get popcorn lung from diacetyl in cigarettes. So when posed with the argument that vaping can cause popcorn lung, which is caused by the diacetyl ingredient of e-juice, people are making the claim that even smokers don't get popcorn lung from the diacetyl in cigarettes, and there are far higher levels of diacetyl in cigarettes. But the thing is, diagnosing popcorn lung is really difficult and is believed to often be misdiagnosed. And because smoke contains so many toxic chemicals, it's hard to say if diacetyl doesn't contribute to some of the problems that smokers already have. And just as a side note here, Dr. Farsalinos published a study a while ago mentioning that cigarette smoke contains a lot of respiratory irritants which probably act synergistically and cause a different pattern of lung disease, and that even post-mortem examinations of smokers that have died found that there are histopathological features of respiratory bronchiolitis. So when diacetyl is combined with other toxins, it could lead to a lung disease that's not popcorn lung, but still potentially popcorn lung. So what you could say instead is that while diacetyl might contribute to lung problems from smoking, there's no solid evidence of risk from inhaling it in the quantities that vapors use in e-juice. And while lung problems from diacetyl might be possible, if it's ever determined to be a proven risk, manufacturers can easily remove it from the e-juice. So this next article is from VapeAboutIt.com, titled The Trademark Infringement War. So what they say is that a comedian named Samantha Bee, who has a show on TBS, recently attended a vaping event seeking to publicize the worst labeling by a juice company. I tried to find a clip of this and I couldn't find one. But anyway, she found what she was looking for. And what Vape About It talks about here in their article is that trademark infringements and using childish characters on e-liquid labels are gaining popularity and is a bad thing. So the root cause of the problem is that companies are focusing on getting more exposure to their brand by imitating trademarks on their labels. This gives them a lot of quick recognition in the beginning and a lot of monetary gain, which is all they care about. And one of the other problems is that when they're called out for these things, a vape shop might stop selling the e-juice because of the trademark infringement, but then tell them that if you change the label, we'll put your stuff back in our stores. But the problem with that is that they're perpetuating the problem because these labels are banking on the fact that they can get instant recognition, and then once they make a change to their label, they get a free pass to retain their revenue streams. So I agree that we shouldn't be supporting any of these companies who are doing trademark infringement on their labels. But something interesting pointed out by one of the commenters here is what the article mentioned earlier about using childish characters and marketing to kids. So what this commenter, Norm Newberger, he said, "At what age do cartoon characters stop appealing to people? Do the 10 and under crowd have any money? Can they get grown-ups to buy for them like they can cereal? No. Marketing e-cigs and e-juice to children is a myth, and playing the kids card is a weapon being used against this and other industries. 100% of children with a few bucks will buy real gummy bears rather than gummy bear flavored e-juice. Let's not think this hostility toward e-cigs is our fault." I think that's a really good point. Alright, this next one is from David Dorn. It's titled The Pleasure Principle. So he starts out by saying, "What are e-cigs all about? They're a quit method, right? Well, no, not really. You can decide to quit completely, and for good, and use e-cigs as the prop to help you get there, but that's not really what they're about. They're not about starting on 20 milligram nicotine e-liquids and gradually weaning yourself off, because if e-cigs are used like nicotine replacement therapy, they fail the same way, meaning relapse." So then he says, okay, so they're a way of continuing your addiction. Well, no, not really that either. More and more studies show that nicotine, absent the products that are in tobacco, actually aren't all that addicting. So instead, electronic cigarettes are a technology that offers people who want to use nicotine a method of using it that is both enjoyable and safe for most purposes. So he mentions here that Professor John Britton posited the notion that nicotine in electronic cigarettes and caffeine are siblings, and that neither of them, in the amounts they're used, are anything other than relatively benign. So nobody cares when someone drinks a cup of coffee, or even gallons a month, so why should nicotine be any different? And even studies are now showing that where kids can't get electronic cigarettes, smoking rates are climbing, instead of smoking rates reversing where electronic cigarettes are more easily accessible. And we've even seen that where kids are taking up electronic cigarettes, they're not moving to smoking. So he says, "There is no convincing reason why anyone, smoker or not, should not have the right to use an electronic cigarette in whichever way they choose. E-cigarettes are there to be enjoyed with or without nicotine." Alright, this next one is from White Cloud Electronic Cigarettes. They have a YouTube channel where they publish a weekly forecast. They're up to episode 6 right now. If you don't subscribe to these guys, you should. These episodes are really interesting. They talk about one subject quickly for a couple of minutes, and they have really good production. So anyway, their latest episode is titled, "Are e-cigarette flavors marketing to kids?" They make a lot of good points here. They start out the video with saying that if adults hate flavors, why do we have things like mango vodka, apple ciders, apricot ales, chocolate stouts, Irish creams, and so on? People in the media would like you to believe that e-cigarette companies are marketing to children using sweet flavors, and they act like e-cigarette companies are driving around the neighborhood like the ice cream man handing out electronic cigarettes to kids on the street. Basically, the bottom line is that adults like flavors, and it's ridiculous to think that all we want to vape is tobacco and menthol. It's a great video and you should check it out and subscribe to their channel. Okay, just a quick update from Mooch. He updated his recommended batteries list. He added the Aspire 1800 mAh ICR batteries and the Sanyo UR 18650 NSX. He also updated the 18650 batteries with his continuous current ratings. So if you're interested in the continuous current ratings, or if you own the Aspire 1800 or Sanyo UR NSX batteries, check out that table and see how he rated them. Okay, so last week I mentioned a thread on ECF about extracting flavors using vegetable glycerin, and that I would be interested in doing something like that in the future. Well, actually in the past week I decided to do a little bit of research on that because I really am interested in it, and I found that there's a sticky thread about extracting flavors on the DIY e-juice subreddit. So I went through it, and there's a lot of good information here. So first, if you're wondering how commercial flavors are created, well, artificial flavors are created by combining carboxylic acid with an alcohol, creating a compound called an ester. So can you create fruit extracts at home? Well, the short answer to that is no. First of all, fruits contain too much sugar, which burns at the temperature that we vape at, which potentially releases toxic fumes, and also there's the aspect of fermentation. You would need to refine the sugar by mixing the raw ingredients with water, then filtering, sometimes with charcoal beds. This is how commercial manufacturers do it. And at home, you just wouldn't have the technology to do so, not affordably. But there are some extraction techniques that you can use for different types of ingredients. For example, vanilla bean. So all you need to do for that one is take 2 vanilla beans, split them down the middle, place them in a test tube with 10 milliliters to 20 milliliters of PG, cap it, and leave it in a drawer with no light. After 2 weeks, you should have a nice natural vanilla extract, which you can mix into your e-juice. Coffee is another one. All you need to do is add a tablespoon of freshly ground coffee in 15 milliliters to 25 milliliters of PG, mixed in a glass jar, then heat it in simmering water bath for about 20 minutes, and then filtering it, for example, through a coffee filter. You can also do things like dry spices like allspice, ginger, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, coriander, cumin, cardamom, anise, and turmeric. And the author of this post mentioned that he made a pumpkin pie recipe, so that's a really interesting thought. And you can also use tobacco. Obviously, you wouldn't want to use the tobacco straight out of a cigarette. You'd want to get a high quality cigar or raw tobacco. And there is a warning here. He mentions don't ever boil PG or VG because they boil at a very high temperature, like oil, that will cause whatever you're extracting to combust. So if you're ever using the heating method to extract your flavorings, use a simmering water bath. So this is really cool. I'm really interested in doing both the vanilla bean and the coffee. I actually wouldn't mind the tobacco either if I could find a really high quality tobacco to use. I think this is something I'm going to try out. Alright, and lastly I wanted to talk about the April Fool's Day stuff last week. So there was only 2 that I really noticed. There were probably a lot happening, but I try to stay off the internet on April Fool's Day. The first one that I noticed that I thought was pretty funny was that the electronic cigarette subreddit redesigned their webpage to look like Fast Tech. They changed their logo to Fast ECR and then had a product grid for all of the stories. So if you scroll down the page, you'd see the title of the post that people were submitting, but the images were being replaced by cheap products from Fast Tech, along with pricing and star reviews. That was pretty funny. And then VapeWild released a $500 bottle of e-juice called PGGB. So they actually did something similar to this last year. They released an e-juice titled Space Pawn for $100 a bottle. Someone posted a message that they got back from VapeWild for making their order, and it said, "Thank you for having faith in our April Fool's Day joke. We are sending you a 30ml bottle of Space Pawn, a 480ml bottle of Space Pawn, an extra large VapeWild t-shirt, and crediting your account with $150. Thanks again for trusting us. Have a great weekend." So I think that's really cool, and if anyone actually took them up on this $500 e-juice offer, I bet they're going to get a lot of really cool stuff. Probably a lot more than $500 worth. So those were some pretty fun April Fool's Day jokes. Okay, that's going to do it for this episode. You'll find the show notes for this episode on VapePassion.com. Just do a search for the VapePassion Show episode 10. You can follow me on Twitter at VapePassion and on Facebook and YouTube. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. And if you have any questions or comments, you can email me at the contact form on my website, VapePassion.com. Alright, I hope to see you back again next week.